Imagine a world untouched, vast forests stretching endlessly, rivers like silver veins weaving through the land, and skies that seemed larger than life. This was the Americas, a place where millions of people had lived for centuries, cultivating, trading, and building civilizations that thrived long before any European set sail across the Atlantic. And then, in the late 15th century, the horizon changed. Columbus's ships appeared as dark silhouettes against the morning sun, carrying with them not only dreams of gold and glory, but the seeds of transformation, and for some, unimaginable devastation. Sit back, relax, and consider the moment when two worlds collided, not just with curiosity and wonder, but with an ambition that would forever alter the course of human history. Some researchers suggest that Europeans arrived with maps etched in imagination, guided by stories of distant lands, while others believe a combination of greed, religious zeal, and sheer navigational daring propelled them westward. The initial encounters were complex, fraught with misunderstanding, awe, and a subtle, creeping tension. The indigenous peoples who met these newcomers were diverse in language, culture, and social organization, each interpreting these strange vessels and pale-skinned strangers through their own lenses of myth, prophecy, and survival. Early chroniclers like Bartolomé de las Casas recorded these interactions with a mix of horror and fascination, describing both the cruelty inflicted by Europeans and the resilience of the native populations. And yet, these first moments were just the opening act of a centuries-long drama that would unfold across islands, forests, and mountains, leaving scars and legacies that endure to this day. Disease, conquest, and forced labor would soon sweep through communities. But before that, there was wonder, hesitation, and the first glimpses of a collision between worlds that had evolved entirely apart. As ships returned to Europe with tales of gold, exotic plants, and strange peoples, a new chapter of human ambition began, one that would stretch across oceans and centuries. But what did these first encounters truly mean for the people on both sides of the Atlantic? How could a handful of wooden ships carrying strangers set the stage for such profound upheaval? The answers are as complex as the oceans they crossed, and from this moment onward, nothing would remain the same. And so, we move from the horizon to the shores, where curiosity meets conquest, and the story of colonization quietly begins, waiting to unfold in layers of power, culture, and mystery as the first European boots pressed into the soft soil of the Caribbean islands. A new order began to take shape, one that would echo across continents for centuries. The Spanish, driven by dreams of gold and the divine mission of spreading Christianity, quickly realized that the land itself was abundant, but the people who inhabited it were vulnerable to the forces they brought with them. The indigenous populations, already reeling from disease and displacement, found themselves subjected to a system that blurred the lines between protection and exploitation, known as the encomienda. This arrangement granted Spanish settlers, or encomenderos, the labor of native peoples in exchange for promises of Christian instruction and safety. Yet, the reality was starkly different. Under the sweltering Caribbean sun, men, women, and children were sent into fields, mines, and households, their lives dictated by quotas of gold, crops, and servitude. Some historians argue that the encomienda was a continuation of medieval practices transplanted from the Iberian Peninsula, echoing the subjugation of Muslims and Jews during the Reconquista. Others suggest that it was an improvisation, born from the immediate need to sustain colonies and extract wealth from the New World. Regardless of origin, the system created a brutal rhythm of daily life. one punctuated by exhaustion, hunger, and the ever-present threat of violence. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar, documented the suffering with searing clarity, contrasting the spiritual ideals of the Spanish crown with the lived reality of oppression. Disease compounded the horror, sweeping through indigenous communities and decimating populations, leaving gaps in villages and fields that made labor shortages an urgent problem. It was this scarcity that would later drive the Spanish and other European powers to turn increasingly toward African slaves, seeking a workforce impervious to the diseases that had ravaged native populations. Yet even as the brutality unfolded, there were moments of adaptation and resistance, subtle negotiations and acts of defiance that hinted at the resilience of the people, who had called these lands home for generations. The encomienda would eventually evolve into the repartimiento, a system intended to curb abuse but still entangled in coercion and forced labor. And so, as gold deposits dwindled and the Caribbean became a crucible of human suffering and economic ambition, a darker pattern emerged, one in which the pursuit of wealth intertwined with ideology, leaving a legacy of inequality and social hierarchy that would ripple across the Americas for centuries. From the sun-baked fields of Hispaniola to the shadowed corridors of colonial power, the story of conquest had only begun. But beyond these islands, even larger forces were at play, waiting to reshape the world in ways that few could yet imagine. As the Caribbean sun beat down on the exhausted shoulders of indigenous laborers, the Spanish faced a grim reality. The native population, ravaged by disease and relentless toil, could no longer sustain the ambitions of empire. Gold had been extracted, crops harvested, and yet the insatiable hunger for wealth and resources demanded more hands, more labor, and more control. It was in this crucible of necessity and greed that the transatlantic slave trade began to reshape the Americas. African slaves, forcibly transported across storm-tossed seas in the darkness of ships' holds, became the backbone of a new economic order. The sugarcane, tall and swaying in the humid breeze, was not merely a crop, but a currency of power and survival. Its cultivation required precision and speed, as once cut, the cane's sweetness could quickly spoil, leaving the planter with nothing but waste. Plantations spread across the Caribbean islands and into Brazil, vast estates of endless green, where the air was thick with the scent of earth and the tang of sugar in processing mills. Here, human lives were measured in tons of cane, in the endless grind of mills and the ceaseless motion of fields. Some researchers suggest that the Portuguese, with their coastal strongholds in Africa, perfected the system of acquiring slaves, trading guns, rum, and manufactured goods for men and women captured in distant wars or raids. Others argue that the Europeans merely exploited existing African networks of enslavement, turning them into a global machinery of suffering. Life expectancy on sugar plantations was short. Death, disease, and brutality were constant companions, requiring a continual influx of new laborers. Yet even amid this darkness, cultural threads persisted. African languages, rhythms, and traditions survived clandestinely, influencing the music, cuisine, and spiritual practices of the New World. The Spanish, Portuguese, English, French, and Dutch all participated in this grim enterprise, each empire carving out its own territories, each colony building its wealth on the forced labor of millions. Across the Americas, this system created a rigid hierarchy, reinforced by laws, social norms, and racial ideology. Beliefs in natural human hierarchies tied to latitude and skin color, were invoked to justify what was morally indefensible. Merchants, planters, and clergy alike profited, while the enslaved endured the relentless pressure of plantation life, their bodies and spirits pressed into service for distant markets and imperial ambitions. As the Atlantic trade network expanded, the Americas were transformed not just physically, but socially and economically, setting the stage for centuries of conflict, adaptation, and cultural fusion. Yet even as the sugar glimmered like gold in European ports, a shadow loomed over the New World, a shadow of suffering, resistance, and an unresolved moral reckoning that would echo far beyond the fields. The story of human exploitation was only deepening, stretching across oceans and generations, waiting to confront the conscience of a continent. As the wheels of colonization turned across the Americas, another force began to shape the New World, the intricate social hierarchies imposed by the Iberian powers, particularly Spain and Portugal. Imagine the bustling plazas of Lima, Mexico City, or Salvador, where languages collided. Smells of exotic spices mingled with the smoke of cooking fires, and the clatter of hooves on cobblestones echoed beneath colonial facades. Here, ancestry dictated every interaction, every opportunity, and every limitation. Spaniards arrived not merely as conquerors, but as architects of a rigid caste system, a social scaffolding that categorized every individual based on their bloodline. At the apex were the Peninsulares Europeans born on the Iberian Peninsula, their skin pale, their wealth and authority unquestioned. Just below them, the Criollos, European descendants born in the Americas, wielded influence locally but were considered second class in the broader imperial hierarchy. Then came the mestizos, offspring of European men and indigenous women, a living bridge between two worlds, often marginalized yet essential to the social fabric. Mulattoes, the children of African slaves and Europeans, occupied a similarly complex position, their status fluctuating depending on circumstance and proximity to power. Indigenous peoples, once sovereign nations, found themselves relegated to the lower rungs, bound by laws, tribute systems, and coercion, while African slaves, stripped of freedom, culture, and choice, occupied the harshest realities of this hierarchy. Some historians argue that these divisions were more than social, they were tools of control, a means of pacifying conquered populations and institutionalizing inequality, while others see them as inevitable outcomes of intimate contact between radically different peoples. Within these stratified communities, cultures collided and fused in ways both violent and subtle. European architecture imposed itself on indigenous landscapes, but native techniques and materials survived in roofs, walls, and city layouts. African rhythms and instruments infiltrated ceremonies, dances, and music, creating traditions that would resonate for centuries. Catholicism became the spiritual glue, often blended with indigenous beliefs, forging syncretic religions that puzzled and fascinated missionaries alike. Food, language, and customs intertwined, creating the distinct tapestries of Latin American identity. Yet beneath the visible blend of culture, tensions simmered as social mobility was tightly restricted, and prejudice dictated lives. The Iberian caste system was not merely about categorizing humans, was about enforcing a worldview, about ensuring that power remained concentrated while diversity was meticulously catalogued and controlled. And as the Americas evolved, this hierarchy would leave deep imprints on politics, wealth, and identity, shaping conflicts, rebellions, and alliances for generations. Even today, echoes of these colonial divisions whisper through the streets, plazas, and genealogies, a reminder that the New World was not merely discovered, but meticulously designed, controlled, and stratified, its peoples bound by invisible lines drawn by conquerors. Centuries ago, as the Iberian powers solidified their foothold in the Americas, a shadow stretched across the Atlantic, one that would define the New World in ways both brutal and enduring: the transatlantic slave trade. Picture the bustling ports of Lisbon, Seville, and later London, where ships bristling with sails awaited their human cargo. The air was thick with the cries of those already captured, the scent of salt and tar mingling with fear and despair. Europeans had discovered a solution to the labor shortages caused by the rapid decline of indigenous populations, African slaves. Entire communities were uprooted from the coasts of West Africa, often through violent raids orchestrated by rival tribes or opportunistic intermediaries. They were then marched to the coast in chains, their eyes wide with terror, the earth pounding under countless footsteps. On board the slave ships, the horrors intensified. Men, women, and children were packed into holds so tight they could barely move. The air fetid and oppressive, disease rampant, mortality rates devastating. Some researchers estimate that as many as 1 in 6 perished before ever reaching the Americas. The triangular trade system emerged. European goods, textiles, alcohols shipped to Africa in exchange for human lives. The slaves transported across the Atlantic to labor in mines, plantations, and households, and the raw products of the New World: sugar, tobacco, cotton returned to European markets, fueling the wealth of empires. Sugar, the white gold of the Caribbean, demanded vast labor forces, and African slaves were pressed into plantations in Barbados, Jamaica, and Brazil, their toil the engine of a global economy. Portuguese and Spanish merchants dominated early trade, but soon English, French, and Dutch powers joined, creating networks so vast that they spanned continents. Some Africans were enslaved by European powers directly, others through intricate local alliances that blurred the lines between trade and conquest. Life expectancy for slaves was cruelly short, forcing continual replenishment, and cultural traditions were violently suppressed, though traces of African music, religion, and language persisted in secret and in hybrid forms. Scholars debate the long-term psychological and social consequences, yet few can deny the scale. Millions uprooted, families shattered, entire cultures transported across oceans under unimaginable suffering. This trade did not merely move bodies. It reshaped economies, demographics, and even the landscapes of the Americas, carving canals, clearing forests, planting vast monocultures of sugar and tobacco, leaving an indelible imprint. And yet, even as this human commerce continued, resistance flickered quiet rebellions, cultural preservation, and the unbroken hope of freedom, threads of defiance woven into a story dominated by cruelty. A grim reminder that the wealth of empires was built upon the backs of those stolen from their homelands. What would follow from these dark currents of commerce would echo across centuries, shaping nations, cultures, and the very fabric of the modern world. As European ambitions grew, the Spanish crown devised a system that would bind the New World's indigenous populations to the service of their conquerors. Imagine the vast Caribbean islands, once vibrant with the sounds of native life, now echoing with the clang of tools in mines and the rhythms of forced labor on fields cleared by hands not their own. The encomenderos Spanish settlers, granted rights by royal decree, were entrusted with protection and Christianization of the native peoples. Yet in practice, it became a tool of exploitation, an organized machinery of extraction. Indigenous men and women were pressed into harvesting gold, tending crops, and performing tasks under the relentless sun, the soil beneath them stained with sweat and, too often, blood. Disease already ravaged communities, but the encomienda amplified suffering, pushing populations to the brink. Tributes of gold, maize, and labor flowed to Spanish hands, filling treasuries and establishing the economic foundations of colonies. Efforts to regulate the system through the laws of Burgos and the new laws of the Indies were met with fierce resistance. The colonists, driven by greed and ambition, ignored decrees while indigenous populations continued to pay with their lives. From the Caribbean, the pressure to expand labor sources grew, and Spain looked to the vast mainland, seeking wealth and cultivable land. Knowing that the native populations could be coerced into productivity, the encomienda was eventually replaced by the repartimiento system, a slightly reformed structure of forced labor. But the essential reality remained. Indigenous people were a resource to be harvested. Some researchers argue that this system created a blueprint for European attitudes toward labor and colonized peoples, blending economic exploitation with cultural domination. Others suggest that the encomienda's collapse in some regions was less about humanitarian concern than logistical necessity, as population losses forced Spanish administrators to adapt. Beyond economics, the system shaped social hierarchies, embedding a rigid stratification that privileged Europeans while subordinating native and mixed-race populations. The legacy of the encomienda can still be traced in patterns of land ownership, labor relations, and social divisions across Latin America, a shadow stretching across centuries. Yet even under such oppression, indigenous communities found ways to preserve their traditions, resist forced conversion, and maintain identity. Their stories are faint, often obscured by colonial records, yet they whisper through time, reminding us that the foundations of empire were neither unchallenged nor uncontested. As we move from these forced labor systems to the rise of plantation economies fueled by African slavery, we begin to see how the insatiable demand for wealth would reshape the Americas in ways both brutal and enduring, leaving traces that echo to the present day. The story of colonization in the Americas cannot be told without confronting the dark and sprawling machinery of the Atlantic slave trade. As indigenous populations plummeted under disease and exploitation, European colonists faced a critical labor shortage, particularly in the Caribbean, where sugar had emerged as a crop of unimaginable value. Cane sugar, once grown in the Atlantic islands of Iberia, now demanded vast fields, constant harvesting, and grinding mills that could transform the stalks into golden, crystalline wealth before the sugar content decayed. Enter the forced importation of African slaves, men and women torn from their homelands, shipped across the Atlantic in conditions so harrowing they defy imagination. Some researchers estimate that over 12 million Africans were transported to the Americas, yet the majority were destined for Brazil and the Caribbean, where mortality rates were brutally high and life expectancy measured in mere years. Coastal African tribes captured and sold individuals in exchange for European goods, rum, firearms, and manufactured items, creating a tragic commerce that stretched continents. On the plantations, slaves worked from dawn to dusk, their bodies pressed into rhythm with the machinery of production, their lives regulated by overseers and their pain transformed into profit. In Portuguese Brazil, in the English, French, and Dutch Caribbean islands, and in the southern English colonies of North America. Enslaved Africans became the backbone of an economy built on violence and extraction. Unlike in Spanish cities, where some enslaved and free blacks could work as artisans, the sugar fields and tobacco plantations demanded sheer physical endurance, a constant replenishment of human labor, and unrelenting control. The Catholic Church in Spanish America grappled with this reality, often attempting to convert slaves while simultaneously accepting the institution of slavery as compatible with Christian doctrine. European theorists rationalized the system, invoking belts of latitude and pseudo-scientific ideas that deemed Africans intelligent yet less spirited, a justification to satisfy conscience while perpetuating cruelty. The Atlantic slave trade created a network of interdependence. Merchants, plantation owners, and financiers bound together in a chain of human suffering. From this, entire economies were forged, colonies grew rich, and societies were fundamentally reshaped. Yet amidst the horror, stories of resilience, culture, and survival flickered through the plantations, hinting at a human spirit that refused to be extinguished. As we leave the sugar fields and cross to the northern colonies where tobacco, rice, and cotton began to dominate, the contours of race, labor, and power start to form the enduring hierarchies that would define the Americas for centuries. A legacy born in blood and shadow, waiting to be examined in the chapters to come. As the colonies expanded, so too did the intricate and often brutal social hierarchies that governed life in the Americas. In Spanish and Portuguese territories, a rigid caste system took root, one that sought to codify the complex mixtures of European, indigenous, and African ancestry into a hierarchy that dictated opportunity, privilege, and oppression. At the top were the Peninsulares, born in Spain or Portugal, whose light skin and ties to the mother country granted them status, wealth, and influence. Just below were the Criollos, European-descended colonists born in the Americas, often wealthy and influential, yet always shadowed by the authority of the peninsula. Beyond them stretched a spectrum of mixed-race groups mestizo, born of European and indigenous unions, and mulatto, the children of European and African unions whose place in society was always contested, negotiated, and precarious. Indigenous peoples, despite their deep roots in the land and complex civilizations prior to European arrival, were relegated to the lower echelons, often forced into labor systems like the encomienda or conscripted into tribute payments that sustained colonial economies. At the very bottom were the Africans, brought in chains from across the Atlantic, whose labor fueled sugar, tobacco, and cotton plantations, and whose culture, resistance, and humanity persisted despite the relentless pressure to erase it. Some researchers suggest that this caste system was not merely about skin color. It was a tool of control, a way to impose European order on a diverse and often resistant population. It created a society where identity, opportunity, and survival were inextricably linked to ancestry, where marriage, occupation, and legal rights were circumscribed by the immutable gaze of colonial authority. In contrast, British colonies in North America developed along different lines, shaped by families who arrived together and a society that largely kept indigenous peoples on the margins. The result was a demographic landscape where the mestizo and mulatto populations that dominate much of Latin America today were far smaller in the north. Gender played a similarly formative role. European women's presence, initially scarce but increasing over the 16th century, influenced patterns of settlement, marriage, and inheritance, while missionaries and colonial authorities imposed European concepts of femininity and domesticity onto indigenous and African women. The interplay of race, gender, and class created a world of strict social codes, rigid hierarchies, and deeply entrenched inequalities, yet also one in which human relationships, alliances, and cultural exchange defied neat categorization. From these structures emerged societies that would carry the legacies of conquest, labor, and mixture into independence, a complex inheritance of power, prejudice, and possibility, waiting for the next wave of European ambitions and colonial transformations to reshape the New World once more. The Americas, vast and untamed, were more than a canvas for conquest. They were a chessboard where land, labor, and power intertwined in ways that would echo for centuries. European colonizers quickly learned that claiming territory was only the first step. Extracting wealth from it required control over both the soil and those who worked it. In regions like Central and South America, dense indigenous populations presented opportunities for coercive labor systems, while in the Caribbean and parts of Brazil, the decimation of native peoples demanded a new workforce. The Spanish implemented the encomienda, and later the systems designed to bind indigenous communities to colonial lords, funneling their labor into gold mines, sugar mills, and agricultural estates. These arrangements were theoretically framed as reciprocal. The Spaniard would provide protection and Christian instruction, but in practice, the promise of protection was almost always overshadowed by exploitation, abuse, and death. Portuguese Brazil followed a similar path, turning vast expanses of fertile land into sugar plantations powered by enslaved Africans, whose lives were measured in the cycles of planting, harvesting, and processing sugarcane. Across the Atlantic, the English, French, and Dutch carved their colonies with different environmental and social logics, favoring settler families in North America, but still relying on enslaved Africans in their Caribbean holdings, where sugar and other tropical crops demanded intensive labor. Some historians argue that these divergent approaches to land and labor were not accidental. They were shaped by geography, climate, and the density of native populations, creating distinct economic incentives that would shape the political and social trajectories of entire regions. Dense, exploitable populations encouraged extraction and coercion, while sparsely populated areas pushed Europeans toward trade, smallholder agriculture, and eventually more participatory governance structures. The results were stark: vast latifundias in Central and South America, controlled by a few elite families, contrasted sharply with the patchwork of smaller farms and settlements in the English colonies. Coffee, sugar, and tobacco were more than crops. They were the lifeblood of an economic system that linked the Americas to Europe, Africa, and beyond. Ports teemed with the constant movement of ships, the roar of markets, and the unending rhythm of production, all underscored by the human cost of labor, indigenous and African lives transformed into commodities. Yet even amid this exploitation, cultural blending, resistance, and adaptation persisted, creating a social fabric that was at once oppressive and profoundly human. From the tangled web of land and labor emerges the next chapter of European ambition, the relentless drive to colonize new frontiers, claim uncharted lands, and transform the very landscape of the Americas, leaving questions of morality, survival, and legacy to echo through the centuries. Sit back and imagine the endless churn of the Atlantic Ocean, a vast, dark expanse where fortunes and human lives were traded as commodities. shaping the fate of continents in ways that are still felt today. The triangular trade, a system of commerce linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas, became the engine of the colonial world. European merchants, driven by the insatiable hunger for sugar, tobacco, and cotton, sought the cheapest and most controllable labor force. In Africa, local kingdoms and coastal tribes captured prisoners from rival communities, selling them to European traders in exchange for guns, rum, and manufactured goods. These enslaved men, women, and children were then crammed into the bowels of slave ships, enduring unspeakable conditions, the air thick with sweat, the stench of disease, the cries of those too weak to survive the voyage. Some perished before reaching the Americas, others arrived only to be thrust into brutal, back-breaking labor on plantations, in mines, or as domestic servants. Life expectancy was shockingly short, especially in the Caribbean and Brazil, where sugar cultivation was both profitable and lethal. Across the Atlantic, in North America, enslaved Africans were fewer in number but no less central to the emerging economies of the southern colonies. Tobacco, rice, and later cotton transformed the landscape, requiring a constant supply of laborers, and the legal codification of slavery ensured that African descent became a permanent marker of status and oppression. This commerce was not just economic, it was a cultural collision of unimaginable scale. African traditions, languages, and beliefs persisted and blended with European and indigenous cultures, creating new social dynamics, religions, and identities that would resonate for centuries. Meanwhile, European ports thrived on the profits of this trade. Ships returning laden with sugar, molasses, and raw materials, feeding markets and fueling further expansion. Some researchers suggest that without this system, European colonization could not have been sustained. Others argue that the human cost, measured in millions of deaths and countless lives broken, reveals a moral calculus that remains deeply unsettling. And yet, amid this system of commerce and suffering, stories of resistance, survival, and resilience emerge. Maroon communities, runaway slaves, and subtle acts of defiance that challenged the very structure of enslavement. From the horrifying scale of the Atlantic trade, we now turn to the complex social hierarchies that developed in the colonies, a web of race, class, and power, where identity itself became a tool of control, and the boundaries between freedom and bondage blurred in ways that shaped the modern Americas. As the ships unloaded their human cargo onto the shores of the Americas, a new world of social complexity began to take shape, a world defined as much by skin as by status, where every shade could dictate one's destiny. In Spanish America, the collision of three populations, indigenous peoples, Europeans, and Africans, gave rise to a meticulously stratified caste system, known as the castas, which assigned social rank according to ancestry and appearance. At the pinnacle were the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe, wielding power, wealth, and influence. Just below them, the Criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas, enjoyed privilege but remained subordinate to the continental-born elite. Mixed-race individuals occupied the spaces in between, born of European and indigenous unions, and the offspring of European and African parentage, navigated societies in which their social mobility was both constrained and negotiable. Indigenous peoples and Africans, whether enslaved or free, found themselves at the bottom, their lives constrained by legal codes, economic exploitation, and cultural marginalization. These divisions were not merely theoretical. They manifested in daily life, from access to education and land ownership to marriage prospects and participation in civic governance. Some historians argue that this system served a dual purpose: to consolidate European control over diverse populations, and to codify inequality in a way that appeared natural, almost inevitable. Color and ancestry became instruments of control, reinforced by laws, church teachings, and social custom, but also by violence, coercion, and subtle pressures that shaped behavior and opportunity. In cities like Mexico City, Lima, and Havana, these hierarchies were visible in the layout of neighborhoods, the professions open to certain groups, and the elaborate record-keeping of lineage in parish registers. Across the Caribbean, the rigid structures of plantation society intensified racial distinctions, with enslaved Africans forced to labor in brutal conditions while European overseers and planters lived in relative luxury. Yet even within this strict framework, cultural exchange occurred. African and indigenous traditions influenced music, cuisine, language, and religious practice, producing hybrid forms that endured long after formal colonial rule waned. In contrast, British colonies in North America developed a different dynamic, with fewer mestizo populations due to European settlement patterns and stricter social segregation from the start, creating a society where racial boundaries hardened differently. As we peer into these intricate social tapestries, one question lingers: how did the legacies of these caste and racial hierarchies shape the political, cultural, and economic landscapes that would emerge centuries later across the Americas? The answers lie in the interplay of power, resistance, and identity. A story that continues to echo in every city, plantation, and village, from the Caribbean islands to the Andean highlands. As the Spanish pushed further into the New World, they faced a fundamental challenge: labor. Vast stretches of land were ripe with gold, silver, and fertile soil. But these treasures were of little use without human hands to extract them. Enter the encomienda system, a structure that promised to civilize and convert indigenous peoples while simultaneously granting Spaniards access to their labor. Under this system, an encomendero conquistador, or a prominent settler, was assigned a number of natives, who were theoretically protected and instructed in Christianity in exchange for labor and tribute. In practice, this system became a tool of relentless exploitation. Native men, women, and children were forced to work fields, tend livestock, construct infrastructure, and endure the suffocating, poisonous conditions of mines where silver and gold extracted from the earth seemed to glisten over pools of human suffering. Laws such as the Burgos Codes of 1512 and the New Laws of 1542 attempted to curb abuse, but enforcement was weak, and resistance by encomenderos meant the system persisted, evolving into the repartimiento, which mandated rotating labor but offered little respite. Disease, harsh treatment, and overwork decimated indigenous populations, with estimates suggesting millions perished over the centuries, a human cost that often rivaled the wealth extracted from their lands. In the Caribbean, the decline of native labor forced Spanish authorities to look elsewhere, and the African slave trade became central to sustaining colonial economies. Across the continent, the machinery of exploitation was accompanied by ideological justifications. The notion that indigenous peoples were naturally subordinate, that conversion to Christianity absolved oppression, and that wealth gained through their labor was divinely sanctioned. Despite this, resistance was never absent. Communities fled to remote highlands, jungles, and deserts, sometimes rebelling in open conflict, other times subtly undermining the colonial system through work slowdowns, sabotage, or the preservation of cultural practices in secret. The encomienda and repartimiento were not merely economic tools. They were instruments that reshaped the social and demographic fabric of the Americas, embedding a legacy of inequality, survival, and adaptation. As we trace these patterns, it becomes clear that the European hunger for land, gold, and control did more than enrich distant monarchs, reshaped entire continents, leaving a shadow that still whispers through the ruins of mines, the layout of old cities, and the memories preserved in oral histories. Next, we move to the rise of the sugar colonies, where African slavery would transform the landscape, labor systems, and human experience in ways as profound as they were brutal, raising questions about the price of empire and the human cost hidden behind the glittering wealth of the New World. As the indigenous populations dwindled under the dual forces of disease and forced labor, European colonists faced a stark reality. The Caribbean was rich in potential but starved of hands to harvest it. Gold, once the draw of Columbus and his contemporaries, was quickly exhausted, leaving planters and conquistadors searching for a more sustainable source of wealth. Sugarcane emerged as the answer crop that was simultaneously exotic, luxurious, and profitable. Its cultivation, however, was far from simple. Cane required careful tending, immediate processing after harvest, and a labor-intensive infrastructure of mills, boiling houses, and storage facilities. The climate was unforgiving, the humidity thick and oppressive, and the cane fields sprawled endlessly, their green stalks rustling like waves in a perpetual wind. To meet the labor demands, European settlers turned to Africa, initiating the transatlantic slave trade on a scale never before seen. Ships crossed the ocean, carrying human cargo bound in chains, with the rhythmic creak of the hull and the damp, suffocating hold creating a hellish prelude to the plantations awaiting them. In Brazil, the Caribbean islands controlled by the Spanish, French, Dutch, and English, black slavery became the backbone of the colonial economy, its brutality codified in law and normalized in daily life. Enslaved Africans endured back-breaking work under the sun, with the cane knives cutting skin, the heat of the boiling vats blistering hands, and the relentless demand for productivity leaving no margin for rest. Life expectancy was short. Death was constant, yet the cycle continued as the trade replenished the labor force with more captured Africans. European justification for this system leaned on twisted interpretations of science and theology, belts of latitude, natural hierarchies, and divine sanction painted a veneer of legitimacy over what was, in reality, mass human suffering. Yet even amidst this horror, communities persisted. African cultural practices, music, religion, language, and social organizations survived in the cracks of oppression, blending with indigenous and European elements to create new, syncretic societies that would outlast colonial rule. The Caribbean, a paradise in appearance, became a crucible of survival, suffering, and adaptation, a place where human endurance was tested to its limits. As the plantation economies expanded, the consequences rippled far beyond the islands themselves, reshaping trade networks, urban centers, and European politics, and setting the stage for a demographic and cultural transformation that echoes across centuries. From one plantation to the next, the question lingers: what price must a society pay for wealth built upon the backs of the enslaved? And how did these early choices define the Americas that we know today? Next, we move to the mainland colonies, where European powers wrestled not only with labor, but with the complex tapestry of indigenous peoples, settlers, and the emerging racial hierarchies that would come to define New World society. As the focus shifts from the sun-scorched Caribbean islands to the sprawling mainland of North and South America, a different set of challenges and dynamics emerges, shaping the contours of colonial life in ways both subtle and profound. Here, Europeans confronted vast landscapes, from dense forests and jagged mountains to fertile river valleys, each presenting its own opportunities and obstacles. Unlike the Caribbean, where sugar dictated the rhythm of labor and life, the mainland required adaptation to a wider variety of crops, climates, and indigenous societies. The Spanish, for instance, established vast viceroyalties such as New Spain and Peru, leveraging the remnants of advanced indigenous civilizations like the Aztec and Inca to extract tribute, labor, and resources. The encomienda system, though gradually modified under legal reforms like the laws of Burgos and the new laws of the Indies, left a legacy of coercion, inequality, and cultural suppression. Meanwhile, French colonists in Canada and along the Mississippi River engaged in fur trade networks, establishing forts and settlements that relied as much on alliances with indigenous peoples as on European enterprise. Their approach, shaped by the need to navigate harsh winters and remote terrain, fostered a relatively cooperative model, at least compared to the brutal plantation economies further south. The English colonies, particularly the southern plantations of Virginia and the Carolinas, imported African slaves beginning in 1619, primarily to cultivate tobacco, rice, and later cotton. Unlike their Iberian counterparts, British settlers often arrived with families, limiting the frequency of intermarriage with indigenous populations and creating a distinct social structure where European settlers maintained a degree of separation from native communities. Across all colonies, the mixture of peoples, European settlers, African slaves, and indigenous populations led to complex social hierarchies and cultural intermingling. Mestizos and mulattoes emerged in Spanish and Portuguese territories, symbolizing both the violence of conquest and the persistence of human connection across imposed boundaries. On the northern continents, these mixtures were less pronounced, but interactions with indigenous groups still shaped trade, diplomacy, and conflict. The mainland colonies also faced the constant challenge of land ownership. Fertility and control became central to colonial economies and power structures. Large estates and smallholder farms, often dictated by geography and imperial policy, laid the groundwork for future political and economic systems, as settlers adapted to the vast and varied landscapes. They left behind not only settlements and crops, but also an enduring question: how would the interplay of coercion, adaptation, and cultural mixing shape the future societies of the Americas? From one frontier to the next, the shadow of conquest and settlement loomed, hinting at the intricate and often painful mosaic that was taking form across the New World. Next, we turn to the complex tapestry of racial and social hierarchies that emerged from this crucible of colonization, where skin color, lineage, and origin dictated one's place in an ever-evolving colonial order. As the colonies expanded and settlers from Europe established footholds across the Americas, a new and rigid social architecture began to take shape, one defined not only by wealth and power, but by the color of one's skin and the origin of one's ancestry. In Spanish and Portuguese territories, the sheer mixture of indigenous peoples, African slaves, and European settlers gave rise to a complex caste system known as the castes, a hierarchy that categorized individuals based on ancestry and skin tone. At the apex were the peninsulares, Europeans born in Spain or Portugal, whose authority was nearly absolute, reinforced by imperial laws and the support of the church. Below them were the criollos, Europeans born in the Americas, often wealthy and influential, but still considered socially inferior to their peninsular counterparts. Next came the mestizos, the children of European and indigenous unions, whose roles varied from rural laborers to artisans in urban centers, sometimes enjoying moderate privileges but never escaping the weight of social prejudice. Mulattoes, born of African and European parentage, occupied another tier, often skilled laborers, craftsmen, or domestic servants, yet still bound by the systemic limitations imposed by their heritage. Indigenous peoples and African slaves formed the base of this hierarchical pyramid, exploited for their labor, subjected to tribute, and denied full social participation. In French colonies, particularly in the Caribbean and Louisiana, similar social stratifications existed, though the mercantile focus on trade and the fur economy sometimes allowed more fluidity, as wealth and alliances could elevate one's position. In British North America, where settlers often arrived with families and intended to establish permanent communities, the racial mixing was far less pronounced, yet rigid systems of race and servitude developed quickly. African slavery became the backbone of southern plantation economies, while indigenous peoples were increasingly pushed to the margins, confined to reservations or forced into treaties that stripped them of land and sovereignty. Across all regions, these social hierarchies were maintained not just through law but through culture, religion, and everyday practice, codifying a world in which birth could predetermine opportunity, freedom, and even survival. These constructs of race and caste were not mere abstractions. They shaped communities, dictated labor, influenced marriage, and even affected legal standing over generations. The entangled lineages of conquerors and the conquered created societies that were neither wholly European nor indigenous, neither entirely free nor fully enslaved, leaving a legacy that persists in the cultural and racial landscapes of the Americas today. As we step deeper into this world, the question emerges: how did these rigid structures of race and labor influence the rise of economies, cities, and the very identity of the New World? Next, we explore the brutal and transformative institution of African slavery and its pivotal role in shaping the economic and human contours of the Americas, where wealth, survival, and human suffering became inextricably linked. As European ambitions in the Americas deepened, an insidious and transformative force began to spread across the continent: African slavery. The plantations, mines, and cities of the New World depended on a labor force that was coerced, commodified, and stripped of freedom. In the Caribbean, sugar-sweet, crystalline, and intensely profitable drove the relentless importation of African slaves. Each journey across the Atlantic a harrowing odyssey of suffering, disease, and death. Ships were tightly packed, their holds dark, suffocating, and fetid, with hundreds of human beings chained together, their cries drowned by the lapping of the sea and the creak of timber. Those who survived were sold to planters whose wealth depended entirely on the relentless toil of their captives. Cutting cane from dawn to dusk under a blazing sun, their lives measured in harvests. In Brazil, the same patterns took root, but alongside the sugar mills, enslaved Africans worked in gold and silver mines, their bodies poisoned by mercury, their spirits broken by exhaustion. Some researchers suggest that African slaves were also forced into urban labor, artisanship, and domestic service, adding complexity to a system that sought total control over every aspect of their lives. Across the mainland of North America, the English colonies began importing African laborers in the early 17th century, beginning in Virginia in 1619, primarily to cultivate tobacco, rice, and eventually cotton. Here too, the human cost was immense, as enslaved populations were kept in perpetual bondage, their families separated, their cultures forcibly suppressed, and their identities reshaped under European oversight. In Spanish America, slavery had earlier roots with the encomienda and repartimento systems, which exploited indigenous labor. But the catastrophic decline of native populations due to disease and forced labor made African slaves the dominant workforce. Some scholars argue that the Catholic Church, while preaching salvation and conversion, often turned a blind eye to the suffering of enslaved Africans, rationalizing their bondage through theories of natural hierarchy and moral obligation. Traders, both European and African, perpetuated the transatlantic system, exchanging guns, rum, and manufactured goods for human lives, creating a network that spanned continents and oceans. By the 18th century, millions of Africans had been transported across the Atlantic, their lives and labor shaping the very foundations of the New World economies. Yet, behind the wealth and expansion, the question remained unspoken but ever present. How could a society flourish on such widespread human suffering? And what shadows would this legacy cast on generations yet to come? Next, we delve into the mechanisms of this trade, the triangular exchange that linked Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a grim cycle of commerce and exploitation. To understand the scale and brutality of European colonization, one must follow the dark currents of the triangular trade, a vast, intercontinental network that bound Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a relentless cycle of wealth and human suffering. Ships laden with manufactured goods, guns, textiles, alcohol, and metal wares departed from European ports, their sails billowing against the horizon as merchants and investors anticipated enormous profits. These goods were traded along the West African coast for enslaved men, women, and children, often captured through warfare or raids by other Africans, then sold under duress to European traders. The human cargo was then packed into the holds of slave ships for the Middle Passage, a journey that became infamous for its horror, crammed bodies chained together, the stench of disease and excrement hanging heavy, the groans and cries of those who knew their freedom had been irrevocably stolen echoing through the dark, suffocating space. Survival was uncertain. Disease, malnutrition, and despair claimed the lives of countless souls before the ships even sighted the Americas. Upon arrival, the enslaved were sold at auction to plantation owners, mine operators, and urban elites, their labor harnessed to extract sugar, tobacco, rice, cotton, gold, and silver, commodities that would enrich European coffers and fuel further expansion. The ships would then return to Europe, laden with these raw materials, completing the triangle and cementing a system where human lives were merely another form of capital. Some historians suggest that the triangular trade not only shaped the economies of the Americas, but also transformed European society, concentrating wealth in port cities, fostering new mercantile classes, and creating the financial instruments insurance joint stock companies, credit networks necessary to sustain such an immense, dehumanizing enterprise. The environmental and cultural impact was profound. Sugarcane fields replaced forests. African and indigenous labor traditions collided and blended under duress, and a new racialized social hierarchy solidified, codified in law and custom, determining who would hold power, who would toil, and who would be enslaved. Others note that the psychological weight of this trade reverberated across generations, leaving scars in the collective memory of entire continents, a silent witness to the cruelty of empire. As we look across the Caribbean islands, Brazil, and the southern colonies of North America, the staggering scale of this human machinery becomes undeniable. Millions uprooted, millions consumed by the relentless drive for wealth. Yet even within this darkness, threads of resistance emerged, rebellions, escapes, cultural preservation, and spiritual defiance reminded the enslaved that their humanity endured. A quiet, stubborn flame amid overwhelming oppression. Next, we move to the European cities that profited most from this commerce, where fortunes were made and empires financed, revealing the hidden urban engines that sustained the Atlantic world's cruel equilibrium. Across the European continent, far from the blistering sun of the Caribbean or the dense jungles of Brazil, the profits of colonization flowed into bustling port cities, transforming them into the throbbing engines of empire. Amsterdam, Lisbon, London, Bordeaux were not merely cities of commerce. They were the nerve centers of an interconnected world fueled by the sweat, blood, and labor of the enslaved. Imagine the cobbled streets glistening under a thin drizzle, warehouses stacked with sugar, tobacco, cotton bales, and gold ingots. The air thick with the mingled scents of salt water, smoke, and exotic spices. Ships docked along the quays, unloading the spoils of distant lands, while merchants in opulent coats calculated profits that could change the fortunes of families, guilds, and even entire nations. Some researchers argue that these cities were laboratories of modern capitalism, where financial innovation, the creation of insurance policies for human cargo, the formation of joint stock companies, the issuance of credit notes was refined to manage the enormous risks of transatlantic trade. It was a system designed to make immense wealth appear almost effortless, a veneer of civility masking the human suffering that underpinned it. Others suggest that the cultural life of these cities, their theaters, salons, and guild halls, was itself shaped by the wealth pouring in from overseas, funding arts and sciences that glorified empire while silencing the voices of those who toiled in the shadows. Yet the streets also bore subtle reminders of the violence beneath this prosperity. Neighborhoods where freed Africans settled, forming enclaves that whispered of resilience. Churches whose stained glass hinted at spiritual justification for enslavement. Even the quiet melancholy of laborers who never saw the ocean but whose livelihoods depended entirely upon it. Beyond economics, these cities became crucibles of ideology, where debates about morality, religion, and natural hierarchy took place, often to rationalize the continued subjugation of distant peoples. Latitude theories, justifications based on climate and perceived strength, were discussed in scholarly salons, feeding the imagination of policymakers who never left home. And so, while plantations thrived under scorching suns, European cities swelled with the spoils, indifferent yet complicit, orchestrating a system that spanned continents and oceans. The machinery of empire was not visible in any single field or port, but existed in the networks linking them. In letters, ledgers, and contracts, in the quiet hum of urban life. From these cities, policy and capital flowed outward, guiding the fates of millions across the Atlantic. Next, we move to the intimate, human side of colonization, the everyday lives of settlers, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans, where the abstract machinery of empire collided with flesh, blood, and survival, revealing a world both ordinary and extraordinary in its cruelty and resilience. Beyond the grand designs of kings, merchants, and conquistadors, the true story of colonization unfolds in the intimate spaces where human lives were caught between ambition and survival. Picture a small village on the edge of a Caribbean coastline, where indigenous families had lived for centuries, tending fields and fishing along coral-strewn shores, suddenly confronted by strangers with steel, horses, and an unfamiliar language. The shock of contact brought not only conquest, but disease, a silent predator that spared no one. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through these communities, leaving skeletal reminders of what some scholars estimate to have been a mortality rate of up to 90%. But the invisible hand of disease was only part of the devastation. The encomienda system, later replaced by the coerced native populations into labor, often in gold mines where the very air was poisoned by dust, or on farms that demanded grueling, unrelenting toil under tropical suns. Families were separated, children taken to serve in distant households. Men worked until their bodies failed, and women were forced to sustain the labor system while enduring exploitation that is difficult to fully comprehend. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, African communities experienced their own upheaval. Coastal tribes participated in the trade, capturing rivals or outsiders and exchanging them for European goods, a system that some historians describe as both complicity and coercion. From the moment of capture, through the horrors of the Middle Passage, and onto plantations or urban labor, enslaved Africans endured unimaginable suffering. Ships crowded with bodies, the stench of fear and disease, and the constant threat of death were a daily reality. Some survived by holding tightly to culture, music, and oral traditions, preserving memory and identity in the face of erasure. Others succumbed, leaving no trace but ledger entries and faint archaeological evidence. The colonists themselves were also entwined in this human drama. Settlers and administrators navigating foreign climates, indigenous resistance, and the ethical dilemmas posed by their dependence on forced labor. Some found prosperity, others despair, and most occupied a moral grey space that modern eyes can scarcely reconcile. Through it all, human resilience, adaptation, and cruelty intertwined, creating a web of interactions that would shape the Americas for centuries. And yet, despite the enormity of these tragedies, life persisted. Hybrid cultures formed, languages merged, and identities were renegotiated, leaving us with societies profoundly transformed. From this intimate, human lens, the next section will explore the creation of racial hierarchies and caste systems, how European powers codified difference, and the lasting echoes of these constructs that would ripple through centuries of American history. As settlers pushed deeper into the Americas, a subtle but insidious structure began to emerge, one that would shape societies long after the first ships arrived: the codification of racial and social hierarchies. Imagine the bustling streets of colonial Lima or Mexico City, where Spanish officials, merchants, enslaved Africans, indigenous peoples, and mestizo children intersected daily, each movement carefully observed, each interaction laden with social expectation, to maintain control and exploit labor efficiently. Colonial authorities, devised a system that categorized people not merely by law but by appearance, ancestry, and perceived morality. A caste system, meticulously documented in portraits, legal codes, and church records. At the apex were the Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Europe, granted privileges, land, and authority over colonial governance. Below them were the Criollos, locally born whites, who often commanded wealth yet were barred from the highest offices. Further down the hierarchy, the mestizo sourcespring of Europeans and indigenous peoples occupied ambiguous positions, navigating both worlds, but always under scrutiny. Mulattoes, children of European and African unions, often found themselves similarly constrained, while indigenous populations and enslaved Africans endured systemic oppression, their labor and lives tightly regulated. These categories were not simply administrative. They dictated marriage, residence, employment, and legal rights, embedding inequality into daily existence. Some researchers suggest that the system drew inspiration from earlier Iberian notions of purity of blood, influenced by centuries of reconquest, religious intolerance, and the codification of Jewish and Muslim ancestry. Others propose that the caste system was a practical response to the complexity of a multi-ethnic, rapidly expanding colonial population, a way for ruling elites to maintain dominance through visible social markers. Beyond legal and social structures, cultural practices reinforced these divisions. Clothing, language, religious instruction, and public ceremonies all signaled status, subtly reminding everyone of their place. Yet the human spirit resisted categorization. Mestizo and mulatto communities developed rich cultural expressions, blending indigenous, African, and European traditions in music, cuisine, and religious practice, often creating identities that defied rigid classification. These hierarchies were not uniformed. Different regions, climates, and economies shaped local variations, and over time, legal definitions shifted, reflecting political needs and demographic realities. Still, the underlying message was clear. Skin, ancestry, and birthplace could determine destiny in the Americas. And as we move next to explore the economic engines driving colonization, the mines, plantations, and the global networks of trade, we will see how these social hierarchies were inseparable from wealth, labor, and power, and how the legacy of these divisions echoes through the Americas even today. Beneath the sun-scorched hills of Peru, the dense tropical canopies of Brazil, and the fertile lowlands of the Caribbean, a silent but relentless engine of empire ground forward. The extraction of wealth through labor, coercion, and ingenuity. Imagine the first Spanish conquistadors surveying the jagged Andes, the mountains glinting with veins of silver, the rivers running heavy with sediment, whispering promises of unimaginable riches. Mines were not merely sites of extraction, they were crucibles of human endurance and suffering, where indigenous men, often shackled and driven beyond natural limits, chipped away at rock with rudimentary tools, their breath thick with dust, their bodies corroded by mercury used in the refining of silver. The Potosi silver mines in modern-day Bolivia became the epitome of colonial greed, yielding fortunes that fueled global trade networks, filling Spanish coffers, and even destabilizing European economies with the flood of precious metals. Beyond the mines, the Caribbean islands and coastal Brazil pulsed with another type of energy, the rhythm of sugar plantations. Here, African slaves, uprooted from their homelands, endured tropical heat, the stench of rotting cane, and the constant threat of disease, their labor transformed into a highly desirable commodity that would flow across oceans to feed European appetites for sweetness and luxury. Plantation life was meticulously organized, fields, mills, and housing arranged to maximize output, overseen by overseers who enforced discipline with whip and barked commands. Some historians suggest that the staggering profitability of these systems made them self-perpetuating, creating a brutal incentive structure that normalized cruelty. Others note the resilience and creativity of the enslaved, who developed networks of cultural and spiritual resistance, from secret languages and religious practices to subtle forms of sabotage, asserting humanity in a system designed to erase it. Meanwhile, ports teemed with ships laden with silver, sugar, tobacco, and enslaved people, connecting the Americas to Europe, Africa, and Asia in a web of commerce that modern economists call the first truly global trade network. The triangular trade was more than commerce. It was a mechanism that transformed continents, reshaped ecosystems, and redrew the lines of power, establishing wealth disparities that would endure for centuries. And as we shift our gaze from the fields and mines to the bustling colonial cities that rose atop this forced labor, the plazas, cathedrals, and markets, we begin to see the human drama unfold in all its complexity, where ambition, oppression, and survival intertwined to create the world that the Americas would inherit. The question remains, how did these engines of wealth shape not just economies, but the very social and cultural fabric of the New World? Step into the streets of Lima, Mexico City, and Havana in the 16th and 17th centuries, and you are met with a tableau of contradictions. Towering cathedrals casting long shadows over narrow, winding alleys, markets alive with the shouts of merchants trading silver, spices, and textiles, and plazas where conquistadors, priests, and officials exercised authority over an often reluctant population. These cities were more than administrative centers. They were instruments of control designed to project Spanish power across vast, unfamiliar territories. Scholars note that the layout of colonial cities reflected the hierarchy of empire. Central plazas surrounded by government buildings, churches, and elite residences, while indigenous neighborhoods and African quarters were pushed to the peripheries, hidden from view yet essential to the functioning of the urban economy. The architecture itself was a message carved from stone and timber, signaling permanence, faith, and dominance. Yet beneath the veneer of order and grandeur lurked tensions, subtle and explosive. The mix of indigenous populations, enslaved Africans, and European settlers created a mosaic of culture, language, and resistance. Street life was filled with negotiations of power, merchants bribing officials, artisans navigating guild rules, and enslaved people finding ways to assert small acts of autonomy. Markets were not just for trade, they were arenas where news, gossip, and culture circulated, shaping social dynamics far beyond the exchange of goods. Religion was a central force, guiding daily life while reinforcing colonial authority. Missionaries, Jesuits, and friars built schools, hospitals, and churches, seeking to convert indigenous populations while often acting as intermediaries between the crown and the local populace. Some historians argue that these religious institutions were both tools of oppression and spaces of refuge, offering protection from the harshest abuses of labor systems like encomienda. Meanwhile, wealth extracted from the mines and plantations flowed into these urban centers, fueling construction, luxury, and bureaucratic machinery. Yet for all the gold and silver, Life in these cities was precarious plagues. Rebellions and social unrest were constant threats, reminding residents that power was fragile, even when enshrined in stone and decree. As we leave the echoing plazas and move toward the sprawling countryside, we begin to see the tensions between urban centers and rural landscapes, between authority and resistance that would shape the evolution of colonial societies. And it is here, in the interplay of wealth, labor, and human ambition, that the deeper mysteries of colonial life reveal themselves, whispering questions about who truly held power and at what cost. Imagine the creaking decks of ships, loaded with goods, men, and lives, cutting across the Atlantic, connecting continents in ways that would forever alter human history. This was the triangular trade, an intricate web linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a cycle of commerce, exploitation, and transformation. European merchants supplied guns, textiles, and manufactured goods to African coasts, where local rulers and traders exchanged them for captives, men, women, and children taken from inland communities. These captives were then transported across the Middle Passage, a harrowing journey marked by disease, despair, and death, toward the Caribbean and the Americas, where their labor-fueled plantations and mines. The scale of this operation is staggering. Millions of Africans, some estimates suggest 12 million, were forcibly moved, each life reduced to a commodity in ledgers and shipping manifests. Once in the Americas, enslaved people labored under brutal conditions, cultivating sugar, tobacco, rice, and cotton, generating wealth that would transform European economies and cities. From the ports of Lisbon, Seville, and Amsterdam, silver and sugar returned to Europe, completing a cycle of human suffering and economic gain that was meticulously organized and meticulously recorded. Some researchers suggest that the sheer scale of this trade required a combination of maritime technology, bureaucratic oversight, and ruthless human management that had never been seen before. Others point to the ways this network reshaped societies. In Africa, communities were destabilized as populations were removed. In the Americas, cultures mixed forcibly, creating the complex, layered societies of mestizos, mulattoes, and Afro-Indigenous peoples. In Europe, wealth from the colonies fueled mercantile empires, wars, and cultural flowering. Within this system, ideas about race, hierarchy, and entitlement hardened, rationalizing horrors with pseudo-scientific theories, latitude-based reasoning, and theological interpretations. Wealth, status, and survival were inextricably linked to the machinery of the Atlantic trade, and every port, dock, and plantation became a node in this sprawling network. Yet beneath the official accounts and ledgers, stories of resistance, rebellion, and cultural survival persisted. Enslaved Africans preserved languages, spiritual practices, and kinship networks. Indigenous peoples adapted to, resisted, or negotiated the impositions of European authority, and European officials constantly maneuvered to maintain control over an inherently unstable system. As we leave the roaring seas and step into the plantations and mines, the human cost of the Atlantic trade becomes undeniable. A reminder that the foundations of wealth and empire were built upon suffering, ingenuity, and resilience. What emerges from this tangled web is not just a story of commerce, but a story of humanity itself, fractured, forced, and enduring against the odds as the centuries unfolded. The echoes of European colonization in the Americas reverberated across every facet of life, leaving legacies that are still visible today. From the bustling cities that rose on once indigenous lands to the sprawling plantations that shaped economies. The marks of conquest, exploitation, and cultural intermingling are impossible to ignore. In Latin America, the Iberian model of colonization left behind a tapestry of language, religion, and social hierarchy, where Spanish and Portuguese became dominant. Catholicism permeated daily life, and caste systems structured society according to skin tone and ancestry. These stratifications, though officially dismantled over time, subtly influence politics, social mobility, and identity even in the modern era. In the Caribbean and Brazil, the African diaspora flourished, creating rich cultures in music, cuisine, spirituality, and language, yet always shadowed by the violent history that brought so many across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, in North America, British colonization left a different imprint, a focus on smallholder farming, property rights, and the gradual development of self-governing institutions laid the groundwork for democratic experiments. Even as indigenous populations were displaced and marginalized, the land itself bears witness to these histories, with vast plantations, urban grids, roads, and forts tracing the strategies of colonial administration and economic exploitation. Scholars argue that natural endowments, like fertile soil or mineral wealth, directed the type of colonization that occurred. Regions conducive to plantation agriculture often developed coercive labor systems and authoritarian hierarchies, while areas suited for small-scale farming encouraged market-based economies and civic institutions. This interplay of geography, economics, and governance created patterns of inequality and opportunity that persisted long after formal colonial rule ended. Beyond economics and governance, the cultural legacies are complex and layered. Languages blended, religions and hybrid identities emerged in ways the original colonizers could not have imagined. Native knowledge of crops, landscapes, and survival strategies intersected with European science and technology, sometimes exploited, sometimes celebrated. And yet, the shadows of colonization lingered: the displacement of indigenous peoples, the intergenerational trauma of slavery, the extraction of wealth, and the environmental transformations that reshaped ecosystems on a continental scale. As we consider the Americas today, one cannot separate the vibrant diversity, innovation, and resilience from the dark history that underpins it. From one city street to the farmlands and forests, the story of colonization whispers through monuments, architecture, and the very fabric of society. And as we turn our attention to the final chapter of this sweeping saga, we are compelled to ask, how did these patterns of conquest, labor, and settlement set the stage for the modern nations that now rise from the shadows of empire? As we reach the final chapter of this vast, complex saga, it is impossible not to pause and reflect on the scale, ambition, and consequences of European colonization in the Americas. Over centuries, empires stretched across oceans, establishing footholds on unfamiliar shores, transforming landscapes, and forever altering the lives of millions. From the ice-bound coasts of Greenland to the tropical islands of the Caribbean, from the dense forests of Brazil to the rolling plains of North America, the Europeans imposed new orders, extracted immense wealth, and reshaped entire ecologies to serve distant capitals. Yet, for all the maps redrawn and colonies founded, the human cost was staggering. Indigenous populations decimated by disease, warfare, and forced labor. Millions of Africans torn from their homelands and enslaved under brutal conditions. And countless lives irreversibly altered in the pursuit of profit, prestige, and power. The story of colonization is not just one of conquest, but also of resilience, adaptation, and the intermingling of cultures that gave rise to entirely new societies. In the Americas, languages, religions, and traditions merged and clashed, creating hybrid identities that defied the intentions of their oppressors. Mestizos, mulattoes, and other mixed populations became living testaments to these intersections, embodying both the violence and creativity of colonial encounters. The environmental consequences, too, were immense. Forests cleared, rivers diverted, crops introduced or eradicated, and ecosystems transformed in ways that still shape the continent today. Scholars continue to debate the long-term effects of these colonial policies, from economic inequality to institutional development, illustrating how choices made hundreds of years ago reverberate into the present. And yet, amid this shadowed history, there is a persistent thread of human ingenuity and survival. Indigenous knowledge, African cultural practices, and European innovations collided, producing enduring legacies in agriculture, architecture, governance, and art. Cities rose on the ruins of older settlements, and new nations emerged from the complex web of conquest, negotiation, and adaptation. As we trace these threads forward, we see the Americas not as static relics of the past, but as living landscapes shaped by centuries of ambition, exploitation, and cultural fusion. So, as you sit back and let the story linger, consider the vastness of human endeavor, the capacity for both creation and destruction, for oppression and resilience. The age of colonization was an era of extremes, a chapter of history defined by ambition, mystery, and consequences that echo to this day. And in this reflection, we are left with a haunting question. Can the full story of human conquest ever truly be understood, or does it remain, like the continents themselves, a landscape of hidden depths, waiting for us to explore further?